Hello, my dearest friends. Svetlana Shlapak, the founder of ukvisasuccess.com, is here. Today's video is about victims of modern slavery. This is just to raise your awareness about the fact that modern slavery does exist. And if you are a victim of modern slavery, after watching this video, you will know what steps to take. And if you're not a victim, then you will know how to spot victims of modern slavery and how to help them further. In this video, we'll start with identifying what modern slavery is, then we'll concentrate on the types of modern slavery offences in the UK, and I will give you examples of this as well. And I'll also talk about national referral mechanism journey and which steps to take and what will be your first step if you are a victim of modern slavery or if you suspect that someone is. Okay, so what is modern slavery? Guys, in the description section, I've given you a link to this very helpful Home Office guidance explaining the main elements of modern slavery, which is a serious and often hidden crime in which people are exploited for criminal gain. The impact can be devastating for the victims. Modern slavery comprises slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labor, and human trafficking. There were an estimated 40 million, that's 40 million in slavery globally in 2016, and around 10 to 13,000 potential victims in the UK. However, many victims are not identified and reported, and that is partially why I've created this video, just to make sure that those in need of help do get it, and they get it immediately. The common factors are that a victim is or is intended to be used or exploited for someone else's, usually financial gain, without respect for their human rights. For adult victims, there will be some elements of coercion involved, such as threats, use of force, deception, or abuse of power. For example, perpetrators can find out personal information about the victim and then use threats against their family in order to manipulate and control the victim. Or they can use the victim's fear about their immigration status to control them, or deceive them with false promises of legitimate jobs. Now, let us consider the types of modern slavery offences in the UK. And there are generally four types: labour exploitation, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, and criminal exploitation. So, labour exploitation. The first category of labour exploitation is where we have victims exploited for multiple purposes in isolated environments. And these victims are often highly vulnerable and are exploited for labour in multitude ways in isolated rural locations. Victims live in offenders' property in really bad conditions and are subject to repeat abuse and are very rarely paid. The next category is victim works for offenders. This is where victims are forced to work directly for offenders in businesses or sites that they own or control. Some offenders may be gang masters, and the main method of exploitation is not paying or illegally underpaying victims. Then we have victims work for someone other than offenders, where victims are employed in a legitimate and often low-skilled jobs with legal working conditions by an employer unrelated to the offender. Most or all wages are taken by offenders, often through control of the victim's bank account. And let me give you an example of the labor exploitation. In this particular example, real case scenario, two Polish brothers living in Nottingham trafficked 18 men from Poland to work in a Sports Direct warehouse. So what happened? These two men targeted vulnerable adults. They helped them open bank accounts and they retained the majority of their wages, forcing these 18 men to work below the national minimum average salary rate. And then one of the victims contacted the employment agency. They informed the police, and this led to 6 years of imprisonment of these two Polish men. The next offense is called domestic servitude, and we have three types here: exploited by the partner, where victims are forced to undertake household chores in their partner or often in their partner's relative's house, and if married, the marriage may have been arranged or forced, and the servitude often occurs alongside domestic abuse and sexual exploitation. The next category of the domestic servitude is where they're being exploited by the relatives, where victims live with and exploited for the household chores and childcare by family members, usually extended family members, and many victims are children. And finally, we have the exploiters that are not related to victims. And in this particular example, victims live with offenders who are often strangers, and victims are forced to undertake household chores and are mostly confined to the house. And here is an example of the domestic servitude for you. So in this particular example, there was a British Pakistani man who invited his wife, visa national wife from Pakistan, who was well educated, and he said that all she needed to do was to look after him and his mother. Sometimes she worked really hard, sometimes 19 hours a day, and she was only given £10 a month to top up her mobile phone. And in February 2014, someone reported the man to the police because they've seen how he was pulling his wife into the house by her hair, and when the police came to the house, they have found her with a black eyes and also broken nose, which was requiring surgery. Later, the woman signed an undertaking saying that she was not acting under pressure, and this exploitation continued for 18 months until she attempted to commit suicide. Then she was taken to her brother-in-law house for safekeeping, and the police was notified. It led to 18 months investigation, and as a result, the man was convicted for 2 years. Sexual exploitation is unfortunately a very common type of modern slavery, and we have three types here. Child sexual exploitation, either group or single exploitation. Then we have forced sex, work in a fixed or changing location, and we also have trafficking for personal gratification. And here is an example of a sexual exploitation. In this particular real-life example, a Czech man and a Romanian girlfriend invited two girls from the Czech Republic, and they said that they would be paid £130 per hour. However, they ended up retaining most of their money, and they've also advertised the girls to perform some services which they never agreed to. And later, the victims of sexual exploitation contacted a charitable organizations, and this was referred to a police. As a result, the man was convicted for 2 years and 7 months, and his girlfriend to 15 months. And both girls safely returned back to their families in Czech Republic. And the final type of modern slavery is criminal exploitation. And here we have quite a few types. The first one is forced gun-related criminality. And this is where victims are forced to undertake gun-related criminal activities, most commonly related to drug networks. Victims are often children who are forced by gangs to transport drugs and money to and from urban areas to suburban areas, in markets and coastal towns. And then the second type is forced labor in illegal activities, where victims are forced to provide labor to offenders for legal purposes. The most common example is where victims are forced to cultivate cannabis in private residences. And the next type of the criminal exploitation is where we have forced acquisitive crime, and this is where victims are forced by offenders to carry out acquisitive crimes such as shoplifting or pickpocketing. Offenders may provide food and accommodation to victims, but rarely pay for that. The next one is quite common, forced begging, and I'll give an example of this in just a moment, where victims are transported by offenders to locations to beg on the streets for money, which is then taken by the offenders. Victims are often children and vulnerable adults. Then we have trafficking for forced sham marriage. This is where traffickers transport EU national victims to the UK and sell these victims to an exploiter in a one-off transaction. Exploiters marry victims to gain immigration advantage and often sexually abuse them. And the final one is where we have financial fraud, including benefit fraud. This is where victims are exploited financially. Most commonly, their identity documents are taken and used to claim benefits, and these types often occur alongside other types of modern slavery. And I would like to give you an example of the forced begging. So in this particular example, there was a 13-year-old Romanian girl who was transported to the UK, and the victim was driven 40 miles to another town 5 days a week, and she was made to sell old copies of Big Issue, which is a charity magazine, outside the entrance to a post office for over 7 hours a day. And then she was beaten and searched at the end of each day, and she was not allowed to keep any of the money she earned. And this victim was poorly fed and poorly clothed, and this was noticed by the members of the public. And then she was exploited for domestic servitude by the offenders looking after their children. The victim was identified by the police during the raid in 2008, following a large-scale investigation by the police into the trafficking of Romanian nationals to the UK. And later, the father was sentenced to 4 years, served 2, and then returned to his family in Romania. Now, guys, I would like to explain the National Referral Mechanism journey. First of all, what is the National Referral Mechanism? The National Referral Mechanism is the framework for identifying and referring potential victims of modern slavery and ensuring they receive the appropriate support. Victims may not be even aware that they are being trafficked or exploited, and many may have consented to elements of their exploitation and accepted their situation. And if you think that the modern slavery has taken place, the case should be referred to the National Referral Mechanism. It should be referred to so-called single competent authority. And the person who makes this referral doesn't need to be absolutely certain that someone is a victim. And if you think that you have encountered a person, adult or child, who has been a victim of modern slavery in England or Wales, you should complete a referral form via the new online process. The new online process allows first responders to submit the National Referral Mechanism through a single online form, regardless of their location in the UK. And this is the address, modernslavery.gov.uk/start. And it doesn't really matter whether or not a victim is an adult or a child. This is a responsive form, so it will vary depending on the answers you are giving when completing this form. It will be assigned a reference number, which will be mailed to the first responder. And here is a list of the organizations which can be considered as first responders. So we have police forces here, certain parts of the Home Office, UK Visas and Immigration, Border Force Immigration Enforcement, national crime agencies, local authorities, gangmasters and labor abuse authorities, health and social care trusts, Salvation Army, a Migrant Help, Medaille Trust, Caline, Bernadette's Charity Unseen, Terror Project in Scotland, NCPCC, BAWSO, New Pathways and Refugee Council. Those who are recognized as potential victims of modern slavery through the National Referral Mechanism have access to specialist tailored support for a period of at least 45 days, which is considerably more than is required by law. By law, is required 28 days, but in the UK, they give 45 days while their case is being considered. And this support may include, but is not limited to, access to relevant legal advice, accommodation, and they are also given protection and independence and emotional and practical help. Support in England and Wales is currently delivered by the Salvation Army and a number of subcontractors. The Salvation Army will assess each potential victim to determine what support is most appropriate. So whenever you think that someone is a victim of modern slavery, or if you are a victim of modern slavery, the first step to take is to call this number 0300303851. Once again, it's 0300303851. You should contact the Salvation Army as soon as possible to make the support referral. And you should also be aware that if you require immediate support, this will be given to you by the Salvation Army. and you will be able to find out more if you visit their website, which provides lots of helpful information as well as lots of examples of the victims that were able to help. And the website address is salvationarmy.org.uk/supporting adult victims, all with dashes. And once again, here is the number. This is where you need to start. And the links which I've mentioned in this video are given in the description section. Guys, if you are a victim of modern slavery, or if you suspect that someone is, you should contact this number in order to help someone to get immediate help and protection.